So shall we do this?
Let's start.
Hey everybody, I'm Ben Yee, Democratic State Committeeman for the 66th Assembly District and Secretary of the Manhattan Democratic Party.
I'm Melissa Stein. I am a county committee member of the 66th Assembly District Part A. I am secretary of that part. And today we are delighted to have our very first guest ever, who is
State Senator Brad Hoylman. I'm the senator for the 27th district, which is right here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today,
this is
Senator.
really exciting.
It's Martin Luther King Day, so it's fantastic. You were out earlier today with two others, weren't you?
I was.
Or a bunch of others, I should say.
A bunch of folks in Times Square protesting Trump's racism with a big rally with 1199 and a bunch of elected officials and activists.
Very apropos. Again, Martin Luther King Day, so it's a perfect time to be making statements about those.
How was the
terrible
rally?
things that
Were there a lot
does.
of people there?
There were a lot of people, a lot of energy, obviously a lot of concern that our country seems to be, veering off course at every turn. So
Yeah.
we gotta fix it.
I find it interesting when I'm on the activist side of things for demonstrations and rallies in Times Square, because there are people there with a certain message, but we're often surrounded by tourists who aren't necessarily feeling the same way. And I've come against people who are really Trump supporters who are out there protesting the protesters. And that can be really uncomfortable, especially in your own city, when you're out there fighting for something you believe in, to have other people sort of naysaying. Which I suppose is what people around the country feel like in other places. You just don't expect that in New York.
Yeah.
Did you find that was happening at all today?
No, there was a lot of love, a lot of shared perspective. We had folks, from every borough, of course the mayor, our congressman, and Assemblywoman Deborah Glick was there, who, among other elected officials who represent us. So it was very important, I think, to have that kind of statement from the Assemblywoman who represents the most Haitians in New York, Rodney's Bichette. So she gave a very powerful and eloquent set of remarks.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's dive into local now since we have limited time.
Yes, local as in state.
State,
Not
because
local
state
as in city,
senator.
but local as in state. So, something we've been talking about since the beginning of this, something I never knew about until last January, and I heard the term IDC, Independent Democratic Conference, which is something that has been keeping Albany at a standstill for a long time. So can you tell us your take on it, and also what's going on with Jeff Klein and the accusations of sexual assault?
Well, wow.
That's a lot for one
That's a
question.
lot. The IDC has really created a whole new dynamic in Albany, and in some ways it was genius to take one segment of the Senate and leverage that to their own devices. I think it's outlived its usefulness. I think Democrats generally see that, and it's time for them to change their stripes. Come home and let's unite. The fact of the matter is I don't think anyone would have predicted Donald Trump's election and the response to the IDC as a result. It's really crystallized the issue among a lot of rank and file voters, people who weren't previously activated on state politics. Believe me, we in Albany have been trying to get folks to pay attention to the shenanigans in the state Senate for years.
Right.
Weirdly, it took Donald Trump to make that happen.
Do you see the IDC coming back onto the terms of the agreement that was put forward by the governor?
Well, I'd like to think so. I mean, I know a lot of people have problems with the agreement as it's written, but none of us wrote it, right? It was, as Andre Stewart Cousins, the leader of the Senate Democrats, says, it was the governor and the state party's construct, not hers.
Does the Senate conference feel comfortable with the deal as it is?
I think the Senate conference has a lot of problems with a deal that's imposed on us. Frankly, I would venture to say the IDC does too. That said, there's so much fluidity, occurring in Albany. The events last week that you mentioned, among others. It's hard to really say where this is going to head.
And where does it stand now? There was that proposal made, and then a lot of people were outraged, and some other people have thought or have said, we can work with this. So where are we today?
Today, as of 4:05 p.m., The deal is still on, but again, it really doesn't kick in until, according to the terms,
Right.
after the budget is finished, after the special elections are called, which they haven't been.
Right, that's another thing that we can talk about as well. So everybody in the state is not represented currently because they're empty Senate seats,
Over 1 million New Yorkers.
which is shocking.
And empty assembly seats as well.
And the governor can call for a special election whenever he wants to, but hasn't. Why? Why wouldn't he call for a special election and have these seats filled?
Well, I think some would say that there's been focus on the state of the state, which occurred last week.
Yeah.
And tomorrow will be the executive budget presentation. So, in fairness, those are two big pieces of the political calendar that you could argue need to be resolved before you get to the politics of calling elections. But I don't know. People should come to their own conclusions about when, where, how these elections. I'm of the opinion that we need them as soon as possible.
Of course.
Because, for one, we have $170 billion budget. If New York was a country, it'd be the 11th largest GDP in the world.
Wow.
And there are hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who don't have a voice
Right, so there are
Yeah.
people
in that
unrepresented in this.
discussion. In particular, some districts that are the poorest in the state,
Right.
Wow.
including the Senate district in the Bronx that was recently vacated by Senator Diaz. So there's a real need to have New Yorkers represented during the budget negotiation. It's not just about the governor
Yeah.
and his wishes. We, as a legislature, have a real responsibility to respond to all those proposals and to refine them and to fight for our own districts. And that's what's missing
Right.
in the
Yeah.
elections not being
If I may, does it seem like much of a deal if the Senate Democrats won't have control for the budget and the IDC comes back? And I remember somebody had asked you at an event how long, like, we don't know the length of a deal, and you had said, oh, I assume it just lasts until the next election or the next session. So how much of a deal is it to have control after the budget until after the next election?
Well,
That's
there
a
are
good
important
question.
things to be done, for sure. Let's say this deal holds, and that's a big
yes.
if, because the events of last week, I think, have thrown a lot into question. But if the deal holds, we still have a couple of months, and we have a real opportunity to pass some important things, like voting reforms,
Mm-hmm.
like same, day voting, like vote by mail, like.
Do you think these things will pass if we?
I'd like to think that we could get some immediate voting reforms passed
That'd be
both
spectacular.
houses. Because we know at the moment a lot of New Yorkers are disenfranchised because they have to work. 30 million Americans voted by mail in the last election, not a single New Yorker. In New York, you have to come up with an excuse, and that's if you want an absentee ballot, which is a cumbersome and difficult process.
And then
for
you
a
have
lot of
to
people.
swear affidavit. You're liable to perjury if they find that you were.
So let's do
at the
something
beach.
for working people. Let's
Yeah.
do something for people, who have a lot of responsibilities on election day. Let's allow them to vote by mail and make it simple and straightforward. That's something we could do right away. Something we should do right away also, is on choice.
Yeah.
New York's laws on women's reproductive health date before Roe v. Wade.
Another thing I didn't know before this past election, and I think that many women in New York assumed we live in New York and New York City that we're protected, but if anything happened to Roe versus Wade, we're not. Not the way that we should
We'd be using the laws of 1973, which aren't even
That's
up to
true.
the standards
Oof.
of the Supreme Court decision. And we know that the Supreme Court is in danger of cratering on choice.
Yes.
And then third, let's look at, LGBT issues and the fact that transgender New Yorkers do not have full rights as other groups do in this state. And in fact, we're the only state in the Northeast that has, not granted
Yes.
our transgender
Oh, is that so?
citizens
know that. And
the
so-
same rights. And that transgender people, more than any other group, are more likely to be targeted by hate crimes. Well, here's the truth. you don't have hate crimes protections for transgender people in the state of New York. That's crazy and needs to be fixed right away. And then finally, and it's something I hope to see in the budget tomorrow, but we'll have to wait,
Yes.
is the statute of limitations on crimes of child sexual abuse. At the
Mhm.
moment, New York has the most punitive laws in the country on child sexual abuse, only next to Alabama. And if you don't file a claim if you've been abused as a child, by the age of 23 years, you have no civil or criminal
Really?
recourse against your abuser. So we have to fix that. But I know Andres, your cousins, has a list, and she wants to be realistic about what's possible should we regain control of the Senate after these special elections with the help of the governor and with the participation of the IDC. But you're right, though. Let's be realistic.
Yeah.
A lot has gone on in the last week in Albany, and we don't know where we're going to be after these seats are filled. But we do have some good news in that Shelley Mayer
Mhm.
from Westchester
Yes.
is the Democratic nominee to succeed George Latimer, who's the new Westchester County executive. She's a phenomenal candidate, and she is the type of candidate we need to be recruiting in the Senate Democrats. Basically, more women, more
Right.
Yeah.
smart people, more community activists with experience, and she's just the kind of person who I think is a model for what we need to do next year.
So I have a quick question. Now that you mentioned activism, what can people out on the streets do to reach out to the governor, to encourage him to have these special elections sooner rather than later, to have a voice about Jeff Klein, which I want to ask you what you think. What can we do? You know, I know people are out there protesting, writing postcards, making phone calls, running for local office like county committee.
All of that helps.
It does?
Everything helps. Look, I think being in person and being in the face of your legislator, making your voices known on social media, showing up at rallies, going to Rise and Resist meetings, all of that is an incredible phenomenon. I don't think we would be as far as we are in talking about a deal, for example, with the IDC,
Right.
if the resistance movement hadn't been sparked. So I think it's the people who have led this to where we are today. We have a lot more to do, and believe me, the politicians, the folks in power, don't want, generally speaking, the Senate Democrats to take over. And a lot of those same people are Democrats because they fear the unknown, and they believe that democracy and democratic politics in particular is a zero-sum game. So if the Senate Democrats take control of the Senate, I think there's a lot of people, whether they be in government or advocacy, who are going to have to adjust to that new reality. So it goes to the issue of like some people being more comfortable with what they know than
Right,
the
and the
unknown.
unknown.
So there has been resistance typically. That's why the Republicans have held the chamber for close to 50 years, even though we have such a solid Democratic majority, more than 2-1 in most places of the
So
state.
you're saying this perspective also impacts the campaigning and organizing work of Democrats independent of the IDC?
Absolutely. Look, it's not a coincidence that, local party organizations in places where there are Republican senators don't put up the strongest candidate. Look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, generally speaking, but in many instances, local party organizations are in cahoots with the Republicans who have controlled the Senate because they have this, we'll deal with the assembly side of the ledger, you can deal with the Democratic side of the ledger. We need to blow all that up, and I think we are doing it, and it's people in the resistance movement who have led that
Getting
effort.
involved in their local county apparatus and
Suddenly, the Democratic organizations have these activists looking over their shoulder and saying, can I see the books? How are these rules written? Why is it so difficult to, elect a vice chairman? How come we're not, given notice for meetings?
Yes.
Yes,
Finally.
we talk about that a lot.
We talk about
Finally,
the-
we're being questioned, and finally, the status quo is being disrupted. That's what this is about. This is about disrupting the Democratic party
This is
too.
great. This is sort of in the sea of angst and craziness and disaster. These are good news things because things
I
are
believe
changing, and
so.
that's so uncomfortable.
I believe so, and it's happened before in cycles of history, right? The reform movement back in the 40s and 50s
Yes.
was part of that too. But I see local clubs sliding back to being anti-reform.
Really?
I think we need to think about the principles of reform.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because of power and vestiges of power among certain interests prefer to control the political clubs.
Mhm.
Political clubs are the building blocks for a lot of campaigns and for the power structure itself.
Yeah.
So if the centers of power can hold on to these clubs, they believe that they can cling to power. So we need to keep talking about reform, and we need to go back and look at history and how clubs like the Village Independent Democrats set a new course for local politics by separating themselves from elected officials, from the county organization,
Yes.
from even the state party, and being independent. It's about having an independent voice, not having a club that's full of party professionals
Yeah.
running the show, but rather having real citizens who have a stake in what's happening in their neighborhood. I know
I
that
just-
sounds old-fashioned, but that's the way to get things
Well,
done.
It's the new school thing to do though as well.
I just ran for the executive committee of the Village Independent Democrats, and what was heartening, and people said to us too, that there are so many new people who ran this year, and so it's a new influx of ideas of many people who haven't been involved before. So yes, there are people who've been doing this for a very long time and had their set ideas about what they wanted, but now so many more people are interested. It was a fascinating thing where we got to get up and speak and to see such different interests, and people came from such different backgrounds, but everybody wants to do something now. And so that to me is also a good news, heartening kind of thing, that people want to be involved and engaged. And sometimes we're finding, especially with county committee, all these people want to come out and do something, and then there isn't really anything to do when you get there.
Yes.
And so we're seeing what we can do to sort of
Yes.
make that change, because people want to help. People
Yes.
want to be engaged and involved.
Yes, and I think we have to remember what political clubs, what their origin, how they exerted influence back in the day, why many of them have died off and are no longer useful. They used to provide a lot of jobs
Right.
and sustenance to
The patronage machine.
patronage, right? So what replaces that now? What makes people motivated to join clubs? They're not just getting a chicken in every pot, right? I think now they have other interests, and I like the fact that clubs like VID have taken an interest in local issues like housing
Yeah.
Yes.
and tenants' rights. How can they make a difference in people's lives? Well, they shouldn't do it through patronage. I mean, that's the anti-reform way.
Right.
The way to do it is to actually win on ideas and push issues that matter to people.
But speaking on winning ideas and going back to the idea of people trying to lock up power that you're mentioning before, you're in the state legislature. I think for a lot of people that the process by which bills are introduced and move through committee, it's all very opaque and difficult to understand. As a state senator, can you tell us what happens if you've got an idea for a bill? So you've actually got some really great ideas for bills. You've got ones dealing with pied-à-terres and Trump taxes, I was going to say. Right?
So
How-
The one I want to push now is, there's a Trump State Park in New York, in Westchester County, and we want to strip that park of its name.
Reasonable.
And certainly now with Trump's racism causing such dismay, there should be no state institution,
Right.
no park, no state building, no state highway, anything, in my opinion, that bears Trump's name. So I want to push that one this session, as well as a bill. I think you're familiar with the Tax Returns Uniformly Made Public Act.
Right.
It took a long time to come up with that acronym, which
It's perfect. It's
would
so beautiful.
require presidential candidates
Yes.
to reveal their taxes before they qualify for the ballot. What's exciting about that bill in particular is that 28 other states have introduced similar legislation or working with a cross-section of legislators, including California, where they passed the Trump Act in the state legislature. It was vetoed incredibly disappointingly by Jerry Brown. And we're hoping to get that.
Is it on the agenda for the state legislature? And can you tell us a little bit about how you come up with an idea,
Like how
and then
it works.
what happens?
Because
Where
a lot
does
of
it go?
people
You write
don't
it
know.
down,
Yeah.
you send it to
Well-
bill drafting, what happens?
It's not Schoolhouse Rock, I'll tell you that.
I was just gonna ask.
It's not Schoolhouse Rock at all. You know, you come up with an idea. Oftentimes, bill ideas come from constituents. Those are the best bills because it's a twofer. It's a good idea, and your constituent wants it. And frankly, you know, you want to continue to get votes from them. So you take the idea, you speak to your council or your legislative director. They write it up. They send it to bill drafting. We have a nonpartisan bill drafting office in the Senate, which was instituted by the Democrats when they were in power briefly.
Right.
They put the bill into like statutory language with the appropriate references. They send it back, you review it, you fix it if there are issues, and then you introduce it. And you introduce it with a memo that describes what the bill should do, and
Introduce it to whom?
you introduce it to the Senate.
The
So
whole Senate.
it's actually introduced through.
Do you talk with the Democratic conference about this beforehand, or?
We do, we should, and it's a good idea because you want to be in concert. So I'm working on a bill on net neutrality.
Oh, brilliant,
To
great.
reverse
Thank
the
you.
FCC's
Thank you.
dunderheaded move on that issue, which really strikes at the heart of a lot of freedom and access to information. But I'll tell you that a couple of my other colleagues are doing the same thing. So it's sometimes better to let 1,000 flowers bloom, but it can also at other times be better to work in concert and try to get everyone on the same page. It really depends. So in this instance, a number of my colleagues are introducing similar bills. So we'll see which one hopefully rises to the top.
Right. And so then you get introduced, and then what happens?
You introduce it. You may have then the chance to get colleagues to co-sponsor it initially. So it's a sign of a good bill if you have a bunch of co-sponsors. And you may then want to have an assembly sponsor simultaneously, and they may want to get co-sponsors.
And how do you
may
get one of
the
those?
assembly-
'Cause you need a.
Sometimes what happens is that you have a really great idea, and you're like, "Oh, I'll let the Daily News know about it," and then you get calls from your colleagues on the assembly side, or I may be calling assembly members if I see a good idea of a bill that, say, Deborah Glick or Linda Rosenthal has introduced.
Right.
And then you sponsor that bill in the assembly. Usually, the person who originated the bill in either the assembly or the Senate kind of leads on strategy. And then once the bill is introduced, what you should be pushing for is a hearing in the committee in which it's introduced. That would be like the logical thing.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's what doesn't happen in the Senate.
What happens
Just
instead?
because a bill is introduced doesn't mean that it will ever see the light of day. Even if you have, say, a plurality of senators supporting it, as is the case in some instances like the Child Victims Act, where even though a plurality of senators have said they support the Child Victims Act, this bill to lift the statute of limitations on crimes of child sexual abuse, the bill can't get a hearing.
Why?
The bill can't get a vote. The bill can't get consideration by the full Senate either. Why? Because the leadership controls everything in the Senate. So John Flanagan really unilaterally, with some input from Senator Klein, presumably, says, I don't want the Child Victims Act. It upsets some of my constituents, maybe the church, maybe the Boy Scouts of America, what have you. So he has the power to unilaterally block that bill from ever seeing the light of day, from ever being discussed, from
Even in
ever
committee.
having a formal hearing or discussion or vote on the floor. So there's so many bills that are arguably controversial, maybe not to folks in the village, but let's say choice. And nobody knows where the state Senate stands on choice because they hide behind procedure. The bill has never gotten a hearing.
It's never been discussed.
It's never gotten a hearing in the Health Committee. It's never gotten a vote on the floor. So senators don't know so senators don't know where each other are on the bill, but more importantly and most disturbingly, their constituents don't know where their senator is on it.
And this is in the bylaws of the Senate that govern how the Senate operates?
Yes, which need to be changed immediately if the Democrats
Right.
ever.
But the leader would have to agree to change
To change it.
Right?
Well, the leader, of course, the new leader, our understood president is extremely reform-minded, and I think she knows that the Senate rules would have to change and give, the opportunity for bills to be heard. They've been blocked for too long. That's why we don't have progress in the Senate, because the power is fully concentrated in one person who, then protects his members from having to take tough votes. Tough if you consider, eating out of the hand of the real estate market,
Right.
which is what Republicans have been doing for decades, protecting, the landlords from, changing the laws and regulations, so
Keeping their tax breaks and all this.
so we can continue to give our tenants some lifeline. The reality is, if we don't change the tenant laws very soon, they're going to be probably no rent-regulated tenants in our lifetime. It's true, because of vacancy decontrol and the opportunity for landlords to raise the rents and force tenants out. That is the law at the moment,
Yes.
and that's why there's so much pressure on the rent regulation system. So
The Assembly
that is
system.
another issue that the Senate Dems need to try to address day one should we regain control of the Senate. But it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough because there are a lot of folks in Albany who don't want us to take control for that very reason.
And the Assembly rules are similar?
The Assembly rules, I can't say I know the Assembly
Sure.
rules, but I do know it's far more democratic with a small d than the Senate. I do know that there was a whole reform movement after the last speaker was forced out, and Carl Hastie has instituted a lot of reforms that I think are positive in that chamber. We haven't had anything like that. When our leader was forced out, nothing similar happened.
So basically, to sum this up,
Yes.
and then I have one quick question. All these ideas are out there, and people are bringing progressive legislation to somewhere where it gets stopped. So it's not that the ideas aren't out there, and it's not that the Democratic senators are not working on ideas. It's just that they get stopped in
The
their
ideas
tracks.
hit a brick wall, and they hit a brick wall because of vested power interests that are funneled through the Senate majority and dictated by John Flanagan.
And because of that, nobody knows where anybody stands on these things to go out to protest against them because he stops
they
it
can
before
hide.
her.
They
So
can hide.
My other question, which is just a I know nothing question. When you bring up a bill idea, do you have to be in the committee that it's introduced into?
No,
So
no.
anybody
A
can
lot of
submit-
my bill ideas. I'm not on the telecom committee, and I'm working on a net neutrality bill that presumably will be sent there.
Would it help if you introduce a bill into a committee that you're on?
It can sometimes help. I'm the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, and I tried to use a procedural mechanism to force a public hearing on the Child Victims Act to raise the statute of limitations on crimes of child sexual abuse.
What happened?
They broke their own rules, even though I had the requisite number of signatures by senators, including, I think the senator had made a mistake, but including a senator from the Independent Democratic Conference. The Judiciary Committee broke the rules and refused to hold a public hearing. Believe me, I'm going to try it again, because
If they break the rules, what's the recourse? You
Yeah,
have
what
to
can you
sue
do after
the
that?
chamber?
unfortunately, courts don't get involved very often in
Sure.
procedural matters involving legislative bodies.
Just
Right.
sounds
And so we don't
frustrating.
really have any recourse. The only recourse is for all of us to win more elections. And that's really what it boils down to.
There we go.
There we go.
have
It's all
to
about
win
elections.
It's all about
elections.
voting in 2018.
Being involved, turning out the vote, talking to voters, making sure people know how important it is to be involved.
Canvassing, phone calls. So quickly, because we know you have to go, Jeff Klein and the allegations.
all I know, as they say, is what I've read in the papers.
Mhm.
But I know they're being taken seriously by Andrew Stewart Cousins, who has called for an independent investigation. I, am frankly extremely concerned, given what has happened nationally in terms of the Me Too movement, that John Flanagan said last week, without apparently weighing the issue for very long, that the Senate is not conducting its own investigation. What kind of message does that send to young people, women, men who have been harassed in the workplace, that the Senate, their legislative body, is not even going to investigate these charges? Now, the truth is that the Senate leadership has called for an independent investigation, and we know that if there was a Senate investigation, frankly, under the current leadership, I might not trust it. But just to come out and say, we're not going to investigate, move on, is such a bad message at this time, and frankly, just incredibly tone deaf to the importance of the issue at large and the seriousness of the charges in this case, which of course are being disputed, and I can't really speak to the actual details of the incident, but I do know that the Senate should take its responsibility more seriously rather than just waving this off as being out of their purview, because nothing in the Senate rules says that they couldn't investigate. John Flanagan kind of just made that up.
Wow, what a guy.
Yeah, and he's running things.
He is.
He is. But hopefully there'll be enough motivated people out there who will vote and pay attention to candidates and make change happen. That's what we're hoping to do with this show, to inform people and get people more involved.
It's an incredible moment for all of us, where you have the activists, paying attention, putting energy and intelligence and expertise, people who are creative and can organize and have experience in the digital and social media world, finally hitting this nexus with politics and the need for change and the desire to resist what's coming out of Washington. We have to seize this. It's just so
But what's
important.
fascinating to me is that it's not just Washington, it's what's coming out of Albany.
I
So
love
for
it.
New Yorkers, there are many fights to fight. There are many ways to be involved, because there is that whole national scene, but there's this whole statewide scene too, which will have such a big impact on our daily lives, on the subway, the MTA.
And let me just say that, I know sometimes congressional politics are sexier than politics in, the state Senate. So you get a lot of New Yorkers, some of our Greenwich Village neighbors, want to take buses and go off to, Pennsylvania and campaign for a congressional seat there. I get it. But if we don't win the Senate back, the Senate is going to be drawing the lines
Redistricting.
for redistricting. And that is the basis of everything in terms of...
Including Congress.
Including Congress and the state Senate. The lines are so out of whack in New York because of the corruption that the state Senate has bred in drawing these lines, that the Brennan Center recently determined that if they were drawn fairly, there'd be a pickup of 6 to 10 more Democratic senators. That's how unfairly and gerrymandered the Senate lines have been drawn in this state. And we've allowed that to happen for decades.
Yes.
But finally people are speaking up.
How do you think our prospects look for 2018 in the Senate elections outside of this IDC deal?
I think it's about candidate recruitment. I think it's about having quality candidates who, speak to local issues, who represent their districts, are sincere and hardworking and smart. I want to see more women running. I think women are just better candidates, particularly when they run against a bunch of old white guys.
Yeah.
And that's the scenario we have in a lot of these Senate seats. And I'm hopeful because Mike Gianaris is doing a great job in recruiting good candidates. So
Who's that?
he is the deputy leader and in charge of the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee. So he handles our political arm and our recruiting and fundraising. So Mike's got a lot on his shoulders.
Yeah.
But people like me and others are going to help him out and support him as much as we can. So I'm looking forward. It's going to be an exciting year, and I hope that the local activists stay local and spend their energies on Albany, because it's just too important.
Yeah, I believe too that when things change at a local level, there will be a ripple effect. And if we can get New York in order, and New York can be the progressive democratic state it should be, that can have a good effect on the rest of the country as well.
Absolutely.
One can hope.
Absolutely. When there was that article in the Times a week or so ago about California, the capital of the resistance.
Yeah.
It should be New York.
It should be New
Absolutely
York.
should be New York.
They're so much better than California.
Yeah.
Now, actually, if I may ask one more thing, you brought up the MTA just in passing. I think it's a very interesting situation because the MTA is an authority, which is a special form of incorporated entity in this state. And I was wondering if you could explain for folks the relationship between the authority and the Senate and the legislature in general, because obviously we have these tremendous problems with the MTA, and it's affecting everybody's lives down here in New York City and in the metro area. And there's a big battle. Oh, who's in charge of funding this thing? Is money being shunted away by the state? Does the city owe more money?
Well, we know that money was being shunted away.
We do know that. That's
to
true.
the tune of $315 million.
What?
The state was charging the MTA, it was revealed by some investigative reporters, charging a special fee for its bonding authority. But the authority has really caused havoc, not just for the MTA, but for NYCHA.
Mm-hmm. The authority structure.
The authority structure, invented by Robert Moses, for the purpose of circumnavigating the state legislature and really allowing, independence, but at the same time, hurting the concept of transparency and accountability. So you have authorities that operate, without really much accountability to the
Oversight.
legislature
So
or
they just
oversight.
kind of do their own thing.
They
You
really
give them
do.
money, but then they do what they want.
They really do, and they do a lot of, they do a lot of funny stuff deep in their books that the legislature, frankly, doesn't have the ability to scrutinize or to check. We don't have a congressional budget office in Albany.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have an independent budget authority to
Right.
check authorities to see what they're doing.
Right.
We don't have those resources.
Can you hold hearings on them?
We can. The majority, though, is the only one who can actually subpoena and
Oh, really?
require.
So that's another brick wall. So even
It's
if
another
somebody
brick wall.
wanted to,
What we
Something
can
for the
do,
assembly to handle then.
what we can do as senators is hold public forums, but they don't have the weight of a hearing, and there's no subpoena powers. I was urging the Senate, for example, to subpoena documents on Hoosick Falls, the water contamination case upstate. They finally relented and did that. But we have a lot of power to investigate and to subpoena, but my Republican colleagues tend not to do it. They don't care about the MTA. What they care about is if the state's going to fund the MTA, they want more money for their roads and bridges upstate.
Right.
But the authority has really, it is really a government in and of itself. So it's problematic. But we'll see tomorrow,
In the budget?
in the budget, how the governor plans to address the issue of funding the MTA and finally fix this system.
does anybody have a way of dismantling those authorities? Would the governor be able to suddenly say, you know what, this isn't working, it's not serving
Sure.
people anymore, and then he could start to take it
Well,
apart?
the legislature could too.
Huh.
Yes, we just need the political will to do it. And we need to determine that they're not working.
Right.
The Port Authority is another.
Oh yeah, but that's across 2 states even.
Right.
So all of these quasi, governmental NGO style, you know, entities that don't really respond to the legislature need to be scrutinized more closely.
So with Democratic leadership, this could be another area that's explored.
I think it's a very interesting area that I'd want to, you know, delve into. Should we be in the majority? For sure.
We will be. Let's
Yes.
say
When
2018
we
is the
are.
year when
Right.
we will be in the majority. Senator, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you for
coming.
your
This is a pleasure.
activism.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. I'm excited to continue to work with you and to
The
be your
same.
first guest.
Oh, yeah.
Now I have to run back to my 4-month-old, and I'm getting mad texts from my
Okay.
husband saying, "Where are you?"
Where are you?
All right, go to it. Thank you again for
Thanks.
coming on. It's
Okay.
fantastic.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Laters.